Hercule Poirot and the Embrace That Stopped the Clock, Chapter 1, The Motionless Clock of Villa Maravilla. The clock in the main hall read 7:45 when the scream pierced the walls of Villa Maravilla like a sharp dagger. It was one of those country mansions on the outskirts of Aix-en-Provence, famous not for its architecture, too recent to inspire respect, but for the soirees held there. This time, the hostess, Madame Delphine Moreau, had organized a dinner to commemorate the engagement of her daughter Camille to the young Vincent Delattre, heir to a northern industrial fortune. But before the soup had even touched the table, tragedy had stopped time, literally. Vincent's body was found in the library, lying next to the desk with a glass of sherry still intact in his hand. The grandfather clock behind him, a dark oak English clock, had stopped with the unnerving precision of a theatrical gesture. The hands read 7:45, although the police later determined that death most likely occurred 15 minutes earlier. Camille Moreau, his fiancée, was the one who found him. Her scream set off a chain reaction. The butler rushed in, followed by Madame Moreau and the rest of the guests. The scene was disturbing. The body showed no signs of violence, but something in his expression, his eyes wide open in surprise, his jaw slightly tilted, suggested that Vincent had not died peacefully. The local physician, Dr. Lefebvre, was immediately summoned. He declared the most likely cause to be poisoning, although without an autopsy he couldn't confirm it. "A quick poison, perhaps administered in the drink," he murmured, looking at the untouched glass. "But it's strange. The contents seem intact." The local authorities began asking questions. Did anyone have a motive to murder young Vincent? At first, the answer seemed to be a resounding no. He was charming, polite, and had no obvious enemies. But it only took a few hours for cracks to begin to form in the otherwise perfect surface of that evening of commitment. Camille's mother, Delphine, discreetly confessed to the commissioner that she didn't fully approve of the marriage. "Vincent is a good young man, of course, but there's something about him, a shadow. My instinct told me he was hiding things." Among the guests was a young writer, Lucien Barrois, a former university classmate of Camille's. His flushed face when the engagement was discussed did not go unnoticed, nor did the presence of Madame Héloïse Roux, a wealthy widow with a reputation for jealousy and an ambiguous history with Vincent's deceased father. And then there was the matter of the clock. Why had it stopped at the exact moment the scream was heard? Was it a coincidence or a warning? The clock had been serviced just a week earlier. It was working perfectly. It was the commissioner himself who, disturbed by the calculated elegance of the crime, suggested in a low voice to Mrs. Moreau, "Have you heard of Monsieur Hercule Poirot?" Delphine, who had spent time in Paris, nodded quickly. "Of course, the Belgian detective, the one with the impossible crimes. Do you think he'd agree to come here?" 2 days later, Hercule Poirot arrived at Villa Maravilla. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in his light grey suit, his tie neatly knotted, and his moustache perfectly waxed. Seeing the entrance to the mansion, he raised an eyebrow. "Too beautiful a scene for a murder," he murmured. "But, as you well know, my dear George, beauty is often the veil that covers the ugliness of truth." And with that comment, he headed inside, where the stopped clock awaited him, as if it were a silent witness to a hug that paralyzed everything. Poirot already sensed that this crime would be no ordinary one. Something in the precision of the scene, in the lack of signs of a struggle, in the exact position of the body, screamed theatre. Someone had intended to tell a story with this death, a meticulously crafted story. But Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells already active, did not believe in symbols. He believed in the psychology of the guilty. Chapter 2. The Company of Suspects. Hercule Poirot inspected the main room with almost ritualistic attention. He didn't question or take notes. He simply observed. His eyes scanned the edges of the tablecloth, the tilt of the paintings, the trace of ash on a saucer abandoned near the piano. "It's astonishing, Monsieur Poirot," said Commissioner Vernier, scratching his temple. "Other detectives ask questions. You look. But yes, my friend, because what one says is often carefully chosen, but what one leaves behind, that unintentionally reveals itself. Did you see, for example, the untouched glass of sherry? It hasn't been drunk. And yet, poisoning. So how did the young man die if he didn't drink? An inhaled poison, perhaps?" Poirot frowned. "Or something more psychological, something more human. Fear can also kill. But before we run, we must walk. Please introduce me to the guests." One by one, they were gathered in the living room. The rain tapped softly against the windows. As the suspects took their seats like actors before a rehearsal, Poirot remained standing. "Thank you for hosting a curious man," he began. "I didn't come to judge you, but to understand. What has exactly happened in this house on this night of celebration, when time decided to stand still?" An awkward silence settled in. The first to speak was Camille Moreau, the bride. She was dressed in premature mourning, her face barely made up, but her eyes weren't crying. They were fixed, calculating. "Vincent, he wasn't what everyone thought he was," she finally said, her voice low. "I loved him, but I knew he was hiding something. Something he didn't want to tell me." Poirot nodded gently. "Anything? Recent?" "Yes, last week. He got a letter and locked himself in the library. He wasn't the same again. He was tense, restless, as if someone knew something about him that shouldn't be revealed." Poirot shifted his gaze to the young man, Lucien Barrois, the writer. "And you, Mr. Barrois, did you know the deceased well?" Lucien couldn't hide his discomfort. His fingers drummed on his knee. "We were classmates at university, yes, but not friends. Vincent was brilliant, yes, but also ambitious, ruthless even. Ruthless? If someone got in his way, he'd move them out of the way. Simple as that." Poirot didn't comment. He just made a mental note of it. Then there was Rue, the elegant widow with the icy gaze. When questioned, she smiled. "I just came out of courtesy. I've known Delphine for years. She wasn't related to Vincent, although I must say she had a magnetic presence. She always seemed to act." Poirot raised an eyebrow. Act? As if he were playing a role. As if he knew the whole world was watching him. He was charming, yes, but too self-conscious, like an actor without an audience. Interesting. Finally, Delphine Moreau Camille's mother intervened. Her tone was firm. Vincent was a young man with a past. I investigated discreetly. Nothing was official, of course, but an acquaintance of mine in Lyon told me about a scandal in his family. Something to do with a former lover of his father. Silence paid, missing documents, shady business. And that made you distrustful. It made me wary. Even though Camille was in love, I feared that Vincent was looking for more than love in this union. Poirot dropped his hands to his sides, thoughtful. "You all have something in common," he said. "Each of you saw a different side of Vincent. And yet none of those faces seemed to be the real one." He turned to the commissioner. "I want to see the clock." Guided to the library, Poirot stopped in front of the imposing grandfather. Clock. He observed it in silence. Then he took a magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the glass, the pendulum, the back. "Funny," he murmured. This clock stopped violently. The pendulum was blocked, not by accident, but by design. Someone wanted it to stop at exactly 7:45, as if that time had any symbolic significance. Poirot stepped back and whispered to himself, "A hug." That stopped the clock. Maybe it wasn't just a metaphor. Maybe it was literal. But he didn't share his thoughts yet. Not entirely. Crime, he sensed, wasn't solved with objects. It was solved with souls. Chapter 3. The Letter That Didn't Burn. That evening, when silence once again fell over Villa Maravilla, and the guests retired to their rooms, Hercule Poirot asked the butler to lead him back to the library. He didn't say it out loud, but something didn't add up. Not yet. A lit fire, a body with no signs of a struggle, and a clock stopped with intent. "Too precise, too theatrical," he murmured, running his hand along the spine of one of the books on the shelf, as if expecting a response. He turned on the desk lamp and sat down in the armchair where Vincent had been found dead. From that vantage point, he observed it carefully. The angle of the chair, the position of the glass, the fire still warm, as if someone had added wood shortly before the discovery. Poirot leaned toward the fireplace. The interior was clean, too clean. He picked through the ashes with a pair of tongs. Remnants of charred paper, yes, but also a small piece that had escaped the flames. He placed it delicately on the table. A fragment of it was still legible. "I can't forgive, but I can't keep quiet any longer either." The rest was scorched. Poirot looked up. The tone of that sentence, the urgency of a confession, a threat, a warning sent to Vincent before his death. "A letter," Poirot murmured. "That wasn't meant to be read, but it wasn't meant to survive either. Someone tried to destroy it, without complete success." At dawn, he asked to speak to Camille again. He found her in the greenhouse, surrounded by withered plants and holding a cup of cold coffee. The young woman was pale, but not despondent. Something about her demeanour suggested restraint, not suffering. "Mademoiselle, may I ask you a different question? About Vincent? No, about you. Did you ever feel watched by him? Not admired, observed, like you were part of a study?" She looked at him, surprised by the specificity of the question. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I often felt that way, as if he was evaluating every word I said, every reaction I had. Always smiling, of course, but it was like standing in front of a mirror that didn't reflect anything." Poirot nodded slowly. A fascinating personality, Monsieur Delattre, and yet extremely calculating. And mirrors, mademoiselle, can break, if you force them too hard. Later, he asked Commissioner Vernier to show him the victim's personal belongings. A small wooden box contained a pocket watch, a fountain pen, 2 unopened letters, and a key ring. Was this with him? Yes, in his right pocket. Poirot took the key ring. 4 keys, 1 large, 2 medium, 1 small. He examined each one with meticulous precision. The small one had a label, C.B. What does this key correspond to? Nobody knows. We've asked the staff and the family. It doesn't seem to match any lock in the house. Poirot remained silent. His gaze was fixed on the key, as if trying to remember something. Then, suddenly, he spoke. "Can I see your room?" Vincent's bedroom in the east wing was sober, but carefully arranged. The bed was made, a desk arranged with papers, and a photograph of Camille in a silver frame. Poirot went straight to the wardrobe. He opened it and inspected its interior. Nothing was out of place. But at the back, hidden behind a row of jackets, he discovered a small, lockable leather chest. The key CB fit perfectly. Inside, he found carefully classified documents, contracts, correspondence, and an unsent letter. The date was recent. The recipient was anonymous. The content was disturbing. I know they won't let me tell the truth, but I can't continue being part of this lie. Marriage to Camille is a dangerous game that someone is manipulating. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Not everyone in this house wants the truth to come out. Poirot folded the letter slowly. It wasn't just a murder anymore. It was an unheeded warning, and most disturbing. Someone in the house knew Vincent was planning to talk. He returned to the library in the late afternoon and placed the partially burned letter next to the one he had just found. Different handwriting, different tone, 2 messages, 2 senders, 2 hidden truths. One tried to keep quiet, the other to warn. One of them is the killer. Poirot wasn't looking at anyone in particular, but his eyes were no longer searching for other objects. They were looking for human inconsistencies. Chapter 4. The Silence of the Maid. The next morning Poirot made an unusual request, to speak not to the family or guests, but to the domestic staff. His interest focused on one person in particular. Annette, the young servant in charge of the east wing of the house, where Vincent's room was located. Annette was of slight build, with an oval face and eyes that refused to meet her interlocutors. When she entered the small sitting room, where Poirot was waiting with Commissioner Vernier, her hands trembled slightly as she discreetly dried herself on her apron. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began in a gentle voice, "I don't wish to question you, nor to make you feel guilty about anything. I only wish to understand what you have seen, and more importantly, what you have chosen not to say." Annette pressed her lips together, glancing briefly at Vernier, who nodded reassuringly. "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't know whether I should speak. I didn't want to cause trouble. Mademoiselle, the problem has already happened. The only thing you can cause now is the truth." The young woman took a deep breath and looked down. "On the day of the engagement, a few hours before dinner, I heard an argument. It was in Mr. Vincent's room. I don't know who the other person was, but the voice It was a woman's. Poirot leaned forward. Do you remember anything that was said? Only fragments. She reproached him for having promised her something he was now cancelling. He responded coldly. He said, "There's no turning back. Marriage is necessary." And you knew it. Then the door slammed shut, and she ran away crying. Did you see her? No, sir. I only heard his hurried footsteps down the hall and down the back stairs. Poirot reflected. And why didn't you say it before? Because I don't want to lose my job. Madame Moreau doesn't tolerate gossip. And I thought, maybe it didn't matter. Everything matters, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. And you have been very brave. Annette looked relieved, though still shaky, and was escorted out of the room. Poirot stood up and began to pace with his hands clasped behind his back. A woman, Commissioner. A woman with a broken promise, with tears and rage. Camille? Eloise? Or someone else? Vernier frowned. Camille doesn't seem like the type to beg. And Eloise? She'd be more likely to hurt with words, not with tears. Which leaves us with someone else. Someone who perhaps hasn't yet appeared in our questions. Or perhaps someone who lied in their answers. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested a review of the house's call and correspondence records. Although the crime seemed to have arisen in a closed setting, Poirot knew that threads of the past often slip like snakes under doors. In Delphine Moreau's office, the detective found a tray of recent letters. Most were bills, social invitations, or thank-you notes for the engagement. But one, with no return address and a cheap letterhead, caught his eye. It was addressed to Delphine, dated just 3 days before the murder. Do you really know who your daughter will marry? Investigate what happened in Lyon 4 years ago. Don't let the same mistake happen again. Poirot raised his eyebrows. Ah, there you go. He returned to Madame Moreau, who at first denied knowing about the letter. But when Poirot placed it on the table, her expression changed. Who showed you this? I found it among your correspondence, madame. It's a clear warning. Did you do what the letter suggested? Delphine remained silent for a few seconds. Yes, I called an old friend in Lyon, a notary. He confirmed to me that there was a scandal, a young woman without resources, who claimed to be engaged to Vincent's father. She was silenced with money. There are no official documents, only rumours. But apparently Vincent tried to approach that woman a few months ago. I don't know. With what intention? Maybe to fix something, or to prevent something from coming to light. Delphine looked down. Maybe both. Poirot sat up slowly. The past returns, madam, but not with steps, but with silences. And the silences in this house have accumulated like ashes that weren't swept away. He turned to Vernier with a focused expression. I need to know who that woman was, the one from the Lion scandal, and I need to find out who wrote this letter, because whoever sees, knows. And while the commissioner went out to carry out his errand, Poirot, alone in the drawing-room, examined the Moreau family portrait again. The hug that stopped the clock was also a farewell, or a betrayal. Chapter 5. The woman nobody mentioned. The next day brought a grey sky, heavy with a fine rain that seemed to hang in the air like an omen. Poirot, as usual, ate breakfast alone, his cup of hot chocolate at his side, and a black leather notebook open on the table. He wrote slowly, pausing every now and then to reflect or straighten his teaspoon with meticulous symmetry. At mid-morning, Commissioner Vernier arrived with the requested information. His face showed both fatigue and anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot," he began unceremoniously, "I have obtained the name of the woman involved in the Lyon scandal. Her name was Claire Beaumont. She worked as an archivist at a law firm where Vincent's father used to do business. According to my contact, she disappeared shortly after that scandal, leaving no fixed address. But, and here's the interesting part, a few months ago she moved to Marseille under a different name." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Another name?" "Claire Bisset. She worked at an antique shop. My contact spoke with the owner. He tells me a woman by that name was away for several days last month, then returned, even more tense. Shortly after, she quit without explanation. And now, no one knows where he is. But there's something else. During that same period, Mr. Vincent was seen several times in Marseille, especially near the old port. He discreetly stayed in a modest pension, without registering under his real name." Poirot sat up, his face imperturbable, but his eyes shining. "So Monsieur Vincent sought out Claire. Why? To protect her? To silence her? Or to recover something from the past? Or maybe," Vernier said seriously, "to hide something from Camille?" Poirot took a couple of steps, his mind turning like precise gears. "No, it's not just about the past anymore, Commissioner. It's about a decision. Vincent was planning something. His unsent letter hints at it. He spoke of a dangerous game, and now we know that game had a name. Claire Beaumont." That afternoon, Poirot asked to gather the inhabitants of Villa Maravilla again, but this time in smaller groups. The first to arrive was Eloise Roux. She looked composed, as always, but there was an uncomfortable spark in her eyes. "Madame Roux, did you know Claire Beaumont?" "Claire," he said slowly, "doesn't ring a bell. She worked in Lyon years ago, but more recently in Marseille. Vincent visited her. Are you sure you've never heard of her?" Eloise kept her composure. "No, although I remember Vincent mentioning an old debt in a conversation with me. I thought he was talking in a financial sense. No, madame. It was something much more human." The next one was Camille. At the mention of Claire, a slight shudder ran across her face. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because Vincent visited her, and because someone sent an anonymous letter to his mother, warning her to investigate his past. Did you know about that?" "No," she replied, lowering her gaze, "although I noticed Vincent was distant, almost absent. Even on the day of the engagement it felt forced, not in love, like he was fulfilling something." "Perhaps he was," said Poirot softly. "Or perhaps he was trying to escape from something that had caught up with him." Then he spoke with Lucien Barrois, the writer. His attitude was still tense, but now he seemed less arrogant, more insecure. "Well, Mr. Barrois, did you know Claire?" "Not directly, but Vincent mentioned to me once that someone from his past had reappeared. He said it could ruin everything." "And then what did you do with that information?" "Nothing. What could I do? It was none of my business, but I noticed he seemed nervous, as if he expected that person to show up here, in the house. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his hands forming a pyramid. And yet, Claire never made it to the engagement dinner, or at least not as a guest, although, perhaps, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. He stood up abruptly and asked the commissioner to show him the staff entry logs for the 3 days prior to the murder. Let's find a name that doesn't fit. A temporary replacement, a nurse, a seamstress, a florist. Someone who was able to infiltrate without being detected. It didn't take long. In the records from the day before the engagement, an assistant seamstress appeared listed under the name Claudine Bertrand. Hired only for the afternoon, according to the log. No one on the staff remembered her clearly, except for Annette, who later confirmed that an older woman with a wide-brimmed hat and a pale face showed up for a few hours and then disappeared. Claire Beaumont, Poirot whispered. She showed up and she left, but did she leave before or after the crime? There was one more piece that fit together, but it hadn't yet fully revealed itself. And Poirot knew it. The clock had stopped at 7:45, and perhaps just at that moment Claire had entered the library, not to kill, but to ask Vincent to keep a promise. And when that hug happened, everything else fell apart. Chapter 6. The Embrace Before the Crime. The rain had stopped, but Via Maravilla was still enveloped in a dense atmosphere. The trees in the garden seemed to whisper secrets to the wind they dared not speak aloud. Poirot, however, walked with determination. He was no longer searching for scattered clues. Now he was weaving, and each thread led him more clearly to a scene before the crime. An intimate encounter, a non-violent gesture, an embrace that changed everything. He asked to be let back into the library. There, in the dim afternoon light, he repositioned himself. He leaned over the desk and visualized the moment with surgical precision. The killer didn't enter this room violently, he muttered to himself. There was no struggle, no signs of a fight. Vincent wasn't alarmed. The sherry glass remained untouched. Chances are he knew whoever came in. What if... Poirot re-examined the back of the chair, the floor at his feet. He had observed all this before, but now, with another question in mind, something stood out. On the oriental tapestry under the desk, a slight indentation in the fabric, as if 2 knees had pressed down hard. It wasn't recent, but it was recent in relation to dinner. Did someone kneel before him or bow down in supplication? Poirot raised his eyebrows. Not an attack, a plea. Minutes later, he asked to see the butler. Monsieur Arnaud, during the evening before dinner. Do you remember if anyone entered the library between 6 and 7? The grey-haired, straight-backed butler frowned, thinking carefully. Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, I remember a woman asking permission to enter. She said she had left something there by mistake. She was wearing a light-coloured coat and a veiled hat. She wasn't one of the ladies of the house, but she spoke with confidence. I assumed she was part of the staff invited by Madame Moreau to make the evening arrangements. Did he leave her alone? Just for a few minutes. Then I came back and he was gone. Poirot nodded. Thanks, Arnaud. That confirms something I suspected. Back in the living room, he found Commissioner Vernier reviewing additional correspondence. Commissioner, Poirot said without delay. Claire Beaumont was here. She entered the library hours before the murder. She begged, perhaps cried. Perhaps she hugged him, and something happened. Not a crime yet, but yes, a breakdown. Vernier frowned. And you think he killed him? Poirot shook his head gently. No, not with his own hands, but with a truth that young Vincent didn't know how to hold. L'heure came to collect an emotional debt, perhaps a promise of protection or recognition, and Vincent, caught between his past and his commitment to Camille, chose to remain silent. And that killed him. The crime wasn't the hug, Commissioner. It was what came afterward. Poirot summoned Camille for another conversation, this time in private, without the weight of the others present. She watched him with a mixture of resignation and something darker, determination. "Did you know about Claire Beaumont?" Poirot asked directly. Camille didn't respond immediately. Her breathing slowed. "I heard her arguing with Vincent from the stairs. I couldn't see them, but I knew it was her. I sensed it was that woman from my past. I hugged him when he left the room. He was pale, as if he didn't know what to do anymore." "What did he say to you?" "He told me he loved me, that nothing would change. But his eyes were absent, as if his soul no longer belonged to him." "And you, mademoiselle, what did you do?" "I went to my room, and I waited." Poirot remained silent. He had noticed something. Camille did not ask, as Vincent had died, not once since his arrival, and that in someone who claims to have loved deeply was not a casual omission. It was a choice. "Did you go back to the library later?" "No. Are you sure?" She raised her chin. "Are you suggesting that I killed him?" Poirot bowed slightly, his voice a whisper that cuts deeper than a shout. "No, mademoiselle, I'm saying that you let him die. And in this story, that may be even more terrible." Later, Poirot met with Vernier again. "Commissioner, we need to investigate whether Vincent had any prescription medication, something for his heart, perhaps. And I want to check his glass, not for poison, but for its absence." "Absence? Exactly. Maybe he wasn't given what he needed. Sometimes you kill yourself. By omission, the game had changed. Murder was no longer a question of who. It was a question of when and how. And Poirot, patient, already saw the whole picture taking shape. Chapter 7. The medicine he never took. Afternoon was slowly slipping into Via Maravilla when Dr. Lefebvre returned with a small metal box he had found in Vincent's luggage. Poirot carefully opened it. Inside were 4 bottles with handwritten labels, one almost empty, the others still sealed. "My friend, were these common medications for Mr. Delattre?" asked Poirot, without taking his eyes off the contents. Lefebvre nodded. "Yes, a mild but constant treatment, a congenital heart condition. Nothing serious if she took her daily dose. And if I didn't take it, it could cause cardiac arrest. Sudden, silent, and difficult to distinguish from natural death." Poirot took the almost empty bottle and compared it with a second identical, still closed bottle. He frowned. How many doses did it originally contain? 30, if I'm not mistaken. Then we have a problem, because according to the service records, Vincent arrived 10 days ago. If he took 1 dose a day, there should be at least half left. But there are less than 5. Vernier, who had been watching from a corner, approached with a grave expression. Do you think someone manipulated the content? No. I think someone distracted him from his routine. Or worse, someone made sure he forgot to take it. The commissioner's face darkened. Are you implying that they let him die by omission? Exactly. A subtle crime. No weapons, no external poison. Just the withdrawal of something essential. Poirot then asked to inspect the breakfast tray served to him on the morning of his death. The staff recalled that Vincent had breakfast alone, in the library. Annette, the maid, confirmed that she had placed the tray on the desk and, as usual, had also left his glass of water and his pill in a small silver box. And when you pick up the tray? The little box was sealed. I thought I'd already taken it before, Annette replied hesitantly. Did you check it? No, sir. Poirot saw her off with a friendly smile. When she left, he slowly closed the door and turned to Vernier. It wasn't the glass of sherry. It was the breakfast. It was the broken habit. He then spoke to Camille again, this time in a softer, almost melancholic tone. Mademoiselle, did you know that Vincent needed daily medication? Yes, I knew it. And did he remind you to take it? He did it alone. He didn't like anyone meddling in that. Not even when I was distracted, overwhelmed, or upset. Camille looked down. The last few days, he was so nervous. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to eat. He didn't want to be watched. He seemed suffocated. Poirot bowed, his voice barely audible. And you just watched him wither away. Camille looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I didn't know what to do. I loved him, Monsieur Poirot, but he was gone even before he died. He was a different man. No, mademoiselle, it was the same. Only he had finally let the truth catch up with him. That evening, Poirot sat alone in the library. The clock stood still, motionless like the heart that had once beaten before him. In his notebook he wrote, "The killer is time." But someone took his watch. It wasn't a hate crime. It was a crime of fear, of passive revenge, of twisted justice. And then he wrote a single word. Allow, do not kill. Allow it to die. A crime without blood or weapons, just with presence, with the decision of not to intervene. The next day, Poirot gathered everyone in the living room, as was his custom, but this time not to accuse immediately, but to rebuild with surgical precision. Chapter 8. Poirot's Final Reconstruction. The fou, grand salon of Villa Maravilla was arranged with unusual solemnity. The armchairs were lined up in front of the fireplace, the curtains half drawn to allow a soft light to enter, and on the coffee table were the key objects: the untouched glass, the medicine box, the unsent letter, and a replica of the clock. Stopped at 7:45, the suspects sat down without being called. They were all there. Camille Moreau, serene but pale. Delphine, her lips pursed as if she feared a revelation. Eloise Roux, with a calculating gaze. Lucien Barrois, with a tense brow. And in the background, Commissioner Vernier and Dr. Lefebvre, standing like guardians of a still hidden truth. Poirot stood, his hands clasped behind his back, pacing slowly across the room. When he spoke, his voice was soft but penetrating, like the murmur of a stilled storm. My lords and ladies, we have reached the point where the line between past and present becomes thin, as thin as the thin line that separates truth from lies. He stopped by the desk. We were presented with the scene of an unexpected death, an interrupted engagement, and a stopped clock. It was naturally assumed that poison, an external influence, was involved. But that wasn't the case. There was no killer substance, only a mission and time. He turned to those present. Vincent Delattre suffered from a heart condition. He was on medication. If he took his daily dose, he lived. If he didn't, he died. And in his final days, troubled by the appearance of a figure from his past, Miss Claire Beaumont, he began to waver between his decisions. He felt caught between duty and truth. Poirot lifted the silver box. The morning of his death, his pill was dispensed as usual. But that morning, for the first time in days, he was alone. No one checked to see if he'd taken it. No one reminded him. He approached Camille. "Mademoiselle, you knew your fiancé was dependent on that drug, and yet you didn't intervene. Not out of carelessness, but out of something more painful, disillusionment." Camille didn't speak. Her lips trembled. When Claire appeared, Poirot continued, "You heard her. You saw him leave, distraught, and then you knew, not with words but with certainty, that their relationship was a lie. Perhaps he was planning to break off the engagement. Perhaps he was only looking to save face. But you wouldn't face the scandal, nor allow him to emerge unscathed from it." Camille looked down, tears already on her cheeks. "Did I kill him? No, mademoiselle, not with your hands. But you also did nothing to prevent his death. You knew he would forget to take his medicine, and you chose not to remind him. That was your crime." Poirot turned to the others. "But you weren't the only one who remained silent. Madame Moreau, you received an anonymous letter warning you about Vincent's past. Instead of confronting him, you investigated in secret. Why not call off the engagement if you had doubts?" Delphine defended herself. "Because my daughter was in love, and because a scandal would destroy our reputation. I thought it could be handled discreetly. And so, madam, your silence fueled the tragedy." Poirot now took Vincent's unmailed letter and held it up. This letter shows that Vincent wanted to break away from the lie. But he didn't find the strength. Maybe Claire asked him to publicly acknowledge something. Maybe she even demanded he break off the engagement, but he didn't, and that destroyed him inside. "And Claire?" Vernier interrupted. "Where does she fit into all this?" Poirot nodded. "Claire Beaumont came here. She infiltrated as a seamstress. She entered the library hours before the crime. She knelt, perhaps hugged him, perhaps forgave him. But he didn't respond. And she left. She didn't come back. She didn't kill him. But she left a void that no one filled." He turned to everyone. This crime wasn't committed with a gun. It was committed with unspoken emotions, with avoided decisions, with the collective will to remain silent. Camille stood up slowly. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I just couldn't stand watching him replace me with a ghost." Poirot watched her without judgment. There are no executioners in this story, just people confronted with truths that are too painful. But crime is still a crime, even when it's committed, without touching it. A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone knew that this time justice wouldn't involve handcuffs or convictions, only conscience. Poirot slowly closed his notebook. The clock stopped at 7:45. But it wasn't time that broke. It was a man's heart, as he realized his life was a sham. Chapter 9. Justice Without Punishment. The morning after the meeting was strangely quiet. The air felt lighter, as if the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for days. Yet in that silence hung something heavier. The knowledge that the crime had been revealed, but that justice, at least in its traditional form, would not come. Poirot ate breakfast with his usual precision. His toast was cut into equal triangles, his hot chocolate sprinkled with cinnamon. But even in this meticulous routine, his expression betrayed introspection. Commissioner Vernier arrived shortly after, still confused by the previous day's conclusion. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, sitting opposite him, "I find it hard to accept that there are no clear culprits. We have a death, we have motives, we have omissions, but no one to arrest." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Commissioner, the law is written to punish actions. But in this case, the crime was an absence, the deliberate failure to save a life. How do you judge a silence? How do you imprison a void? And Camille?" Vernier asked. "Shouldn't she be held accountable for what she did?" "And what exactly did he do? He didn't poison, he didn't push, he didn't sabotage. He just failed to intervene. In a moral world, perhaps that deserves condemnation. In the legal world, it's not enough." The commissioner rubbed his hands in frustration. "So, is this the way it is?" Poirot took a sip from his cup and spoke slowly. "What will happen now, Commissioner, is not formal justice, but a deeper justice, the kind inflicted by conscience. Camille will have to live, knowing that her decision killed the man she loved. Delphine will know that her desire to preserve appearances helped destroy her family. Claire, wherever she is, will live with the certainty that her truth came too late, and me," he added with a slight sigh, "I will live with the bitterness of having arrived when the crime had already been committed, because of time." Later, Poirot asked to see Camille alone. They met in the greenhouse, where rain-dampened leaves were still sliding down the glass. "Mademoiselle, I didn't come to condemn you, not even to interrogate you. But I did come to offer you something." She looked at him with red eyes, her voice muffled. "What could you offer me, Monsieur Poirot? Redemption? No. One option. You can leave this house, pretend it was an inevitable tragedy, return to your life with a new narrative, or sure, you can write the truth." "The truth," Poirot nodded. "A letter. For yourself, for Claire, for whomever you wish. Not for publication, just so silence doesn't kill again." Camille remained silent for a long time, looking at a withered orchid. "What, if I can't forgive myself?" "Then start by not lying to yourself. That's more than many people achieve." She nodded barely, and without adding anything else, she walked away. That afternoon Poirot gathered his things. In the hall, as the butler handed him his hat and cane, Delphine Moreau approached him. "Do you really think this ends here?" "No, madam. What ends is the mystery. What begins now is the weight of truth." She didn't respond. She just watched, him as he crossed the front door, the echo of his footsteps resonating through the halls like a final farewell. Already on the train, as the Provençal landscape flashed before his eyes, Poirot took out his notebook. On the last page he wrote, "The perfect crime is not one that leaves no evidence. It is one that disguises itself as an inevitable tragedy. But the little grey cells are not fooled, because even silence has shape, colour, and logic." He gently closed the notebook, and there you have it. Chapter 10. The Echo of a Broken Clock. Days after leaving Villa Maravilla, Hercule Poirot found himself in his apartment on the Rue des Petits Champs in Paris. The rain tapped softly against the window panes, while the grandfather clock on the corner, one that always worked with the precision he so admired, marked 7:45 sharp. "An hour that will haunt me," murmured Poirot, pouring himself a cup of herbal tea. He had kept Vincent Delatre's entire file in a brown folder, unlabelled. He wouldn't include it among his brilliantly solved cases. This wasn't a triumph. It was a reminder that even the best reasoning can't alter the outcome when the crime stems from neglect, not from the act. The doorbell rang shortly after. Georges, his faithful assistant, announced that a letter had arrived, with no return address, but scented with white roses. Poirot took it delicately. The paper was thick and of good quality, but what caught his attention was the firm, elegant handwriting, Camille Moreau. He opened it carefully. The contents weren't long, but each word carried weight. "Mr. Poirot, I did what you suggested. I wrote the truth. Not a confession, but a story. A way to avoid running away from the shadow that follows me. I won't seek forgiveness. I don't deserve it yet, but I will seek understanding. Because, as you said, silence can also be a form of death. I've decided to sell Villa Maravilla. There's too much echo in its walls, and too many broken clocks. Thank you for not judging me, and for forcing me to look without evasion. Camille." Poirot slowly closed the letter and placed it next to the notebook in which he had written his conclusions. Then, with deliberate movements, he walked to his grandfather clock and looked at it for a moment, as if wondering if that one too could be stopped with a symbolic gesture. "No," he whispered, "life goes on, even after the most silent crime." Went to his desk and began to write a note for his editor. A reflection rather than a story, titled "The Crime Without a Culprit in It," he would explore how omissions, moral decisions, and broken commitments could weave a web more lethal than any poison. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside the apartment everything was in order, symmetrical, controlled, just the way Poirot liked it. Only at the end of the day, as he put away his notebook and turned off the lamp, did he allow a thought to visit him, fleeting like the ticking of an invisible clock. There are crimes that the law does not touch, but that the conscience never forgets. And with that thought, he said goodbye to the case, not with a verdict, but with an echo that still, in some corner of Villa Maravilla, resonated with the hour when the world broke. 45, Chapter 11. The Little Grey Cells Reflect. The Parisian fog hung thick over the city when Poirot, now recovered from his trip to Provence, accepted an invitation to lunch with an old acquaintance at the Circle of Reason, a discreet conversation club where, The intellectual elite discussed ethics, philosophy, and occasionally famous crimes. Poirot liked the place not for its exclusivity, but for the orderly silence of its library, where the chairs didn't creak and the clocks were never late. During lunch, one of the club members, Professor Charles Delorme, an expert in comparative criminology, approached him with a courteous smile. "Monsieur Poirot, I read in Le Matin that you were recently in Provence, solving something unusual." Poirot tilted his head. "Unusual, yes, but not in its form. Unusual in its absence." Delorme raised an eyebrow. "Absence?" Poirot delicately wiped an invisible crumb from his napkin before answering. "A death without blood, without a weapon, without a witness. A death committed by mistake, not by action. A crime committed in the space between intention and omission." The professor smiled with slight skepticism. "And you resolved it without any guilty party?" Poirot nodded gently. "I solved it, but I didn't punish him. It's not the detective's job to decide what conscience has already done." Delorme left with a thoughtful expression, but Poirot remained meditating in silence, looking into his cup of black coffee. The Vincent Delattre case didn't escape his mind like others, not because the mystery was more complex, but because this time the crime had no face. That night, back in his apartment, Poirot opened his notebook for the last time about the case. On the final page, he wrote an appendix, a mental postscript dedicated not to the crime, but to the characters, about Camille Moreau. Intelligent, proud, unable to bear the crumbling of the fiction she'd built. She didn't kill him, but she allowed fate to do the work her dignity couldn't. About Delphine Moreau, a mother willing to cover up the past to avoid scandal, and in doing so, she pushed her daughter to embrace a lie as her future. Sobriclair Beaumont, the forgotten piece of the puzzle. He wasn't seeking revenge, but redemption, and in his quest to obtain it, he caused the rupture that led to his death. About Vincent Delattre, a son of privilege, a martyr to his own cowardice. He tried to escape his history, but time gave him no escape. Poirot carefully closed the notebook, labelling it simply, "A case without culprits. Only consequences," but it wasn't. Entirely true, there was one culprit perhaps, the most silent of all. The omission, the choice not to do. And as the city slept, Poirot reflected on how many times in his life as a detective he had pursued a criminal who acts. This time he had faced one who did nothing, and yet caused everything. Before turning off the light, he went to his bookshelf and removed an old volume of Rousseau. In the margin of a yellowed page, Poirot had underlined a sentence years before. "The greatest blame does not always lie with the one who acts, but with the one who knows and remains silent." With one last glance at the clock, which read 7:45 without ever having stopped, Poirot turned off the lamp and let silence reign, this time without crime. Chapter 12. The Last Witness. Spring was arriving in Paris with an almost timid delicacy. The damp streets were beginning to warm under a distant sun, and the flower sellers were reappearing on street corners with tulips, daffodils, and violets. On the Rue des Petits Champs, Poirot allowed himself a brief morning stroll, cane in hand, greeting the neighbours with a calculatedly elegant nod. He had closed the Delattre case in his mind, filing it under the category of crimes without legal punishment but with moral resonance, an unofficial section of his career. But as is often the case with the most subtle mysteries, its echo hadn't entirely died away. Upon returning to his apartment that morning, Georges handed him an unstamped envelope left by a young woman in a navy blue hat. Poirot raised an eyebrow. It wasn't common for visitors to leave letters without introducing themselves. The content stopped him immediately. Mr. Poirot, I was the assistant seamstress that day. I'm not Claire Beaumont. My name is Sylvie Mercier. I learned of the engagement from the newspapers and from a friend on the staff at Villa Maravilla. I was part of Vincent's past. Not in Lyon, but in Marseille. I didn't come to demand anything, just to see him one more time. He didn't fully recognize me. We spoke briefly. I asked him if he still remembered what he promised me when we met. He didn't answer. He just stared at me as if I were a shadow. And then I knew I couldn't stay. When I left, I saw a woman watching us from the hallway. I can't say for sure who it was, but she was holding a white handkerchief, and she was clenching her fists. I don't want to get involved any further. I just needed to tell you the whole truth, not for justice, but for peace. Sylvie. Poirot closed his eyes slowly, pressing the letter between his fingers. Another woman from his past? Another truth Vincent chose to ignore? Or simply a figure fading into the collective guilt surrounding her death? The mention of the woman in the corridor, white handkerchief, clenched fists, fitted into an image that Poirot had already seen, but which until then had no face. Eloise Rue, always observant, always restrained. And now, perhaps closer than she had admitted, Poirot asked for his carriage to be prepared. It wasn't his custom to reopen closed cases, but this wasn't a formal case. It was a spectre still moving. The truth continued to seep in like water through ancient cracks. Madame Eloise Rue welcomed him into her Parisian apartment with her usual elegant smile. Monsieur Poirot, I didn't expect to see you again. Nor I to you, madam, but as you know, the truth rarely closes the door firmly. It always leaves a crack. Eloise served tea with an impeccable gesture. So you've come for Claire Beaumont? No, I came for Sylvie Mercier. She stopped dead in her tracks, the spoon hovering over the cup. Does that name ring a bell, madam? No, he said after a brief hesitation. I should. Poirot looked at her in silence. She was at Villa Maravilla. The same day as the crime. You saw her, I suspect. You didn't say anything, because what you saw was more than just a visit. It threatened the entire story Vincent was trying to maintain. Eloise gently put down the spoon. He played with fire, she said finally. He wasn't an evil man, but he was dangerous, charming until he got what he wanted. Then nothing, silence, absence. Poirot nodded slowly. And you, madam, did you love him? Just once, she replied sadly. Years ago, when I still thought love was enough. And now I know that if only one of us doesn't dare, everything falls apart. Poirot stood up. He didn't need to hear any more. There was no additional crime, just another layer of truth. Another heart that broke in silence. That night, Poirot wrote again, not in his casebook, but in his private diary. I have learned that there are crimes that will never see a trial, because their judgment is already carried out in the glances avoided, in the words left unspoken, in the letters never sent. Vincent didn't die just because of a medical oversight. He died from a web of tangled ties that no one dared to cut. And in the end, every person close to him held a corner of the thread that stretched taut until it snapped. Poirot closed the newspaper and turned off the light. In his mind, the Villa Maravilla clock was still stopped at 7:45. But now I knew it. Wasn't just a gesture, but for all those who did not dare to stop him in time. Chapter 13. The Silent Testament. The early morning in Paris was cold and clear when Poirot received an unexpected telegram. It came from a notary's office in Aix-en-Provence, and sounded more intriguing than legal. Monsieur Poirot, following your visit to Villa Maravilla, we have proceeded to open the will of the late Vincent Delattre. There is an appendix sealed with his signature dated 3 days before his death. In it, you are named as a witness. We request your presence as soon as possible. Poirot, who was seldom surprised, raised an eyebrow. A posthumous will with a dedication? And for me, she said softly as she put down her untouched cup of hot chocolate. Georges was already packing his suitcase even before he gave the order. 2 days later, in an austere room of the office Belleton Brothers, Poirot found himself facing a sealed envelope with his name elegantly calligraphed. With him were Commissioner Vernier, Delphine Moreau, Camille, who was visibly worse for wear, and, to everyone's surprise, Claire Beaumont, who had been formally summoned following the latest investigations. The notary, a wiry man with a trembling voice, silently broke the seal and began to read the attached document. It wasn't a distribution of assets. It was a letter. To anyone who reads this after my death, I don't know if I died by someone else's decision or my own, but I know the end is near, and I feel I must record what I was never able to say out loud. I've built my life like an actor in his finest role, kind, seductive, effective, but never brave. I was a coward in the face of the past. Claire, you know that. I failed you. And Camille, you know it too, even if you haven't told me. I tried to comply with everyone, with duties, with appearances, with names that weren't mine, and in that I forgot who I really was. This will has no inheritance, because I have nothing worth inheriting. But it does have a wish, that those who knew me know that the only real thing I ever had was fear, of disappointing, of losing, of facing off. Don't look for someone to blame. Don't judge too much. Just get rid of me, and move on. Vincent Delattre. The silence that followed the reading was thick, like a sudden fog in the office. No one spoke. No one dared. Poirot was the first to rise, his expression grave. A man who lived like a ghost in his own life, she said, and now, even in his death, he leaves us with a trail of smoke, not a confession, not an accusation, but an invitation to forget. Claire was the second to rise. Her serene face concealed an ancient sadness. I don't want anything from him, she said simply. Just no more lies. Camille didn't respond. She didn't cry. but her straight back began to slump as she silently left the office, as if some of the weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders, and another part had been forever anchored. Delphine, as expected, did not speak. On the way back to Paris, Poirot allowed himself one last thought. As the train rolled through the grey fields of southern France, the Belgian detective stared out the window, his notebook on his knees. He opened a new page. He wrote in black ink, slowly and unadorned. The truth isn't always revealed out of necessity. Sometimes it's revealed out of desperation. Vincent didn't leave an inheritance, but he did leave a choice for each person involved, to accept the shadow of their actions or to continue pretending that only the light defines their lives. He was not murdered. He didn't commit suicide. He let himself die, in the arms of all those who didn't know how to hold him. Poirot carefully closed the notebook, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't write "case closed." He only wrote one word. Humanity. Chapter 14. The last of the silences. The return. To Paris this time brought no relief. Despite having closed the most enigmatic chapter of his last case, Poirot felt something still hanging by an invisible thread. A tension that wasn't rational, but emotional, as if the clock at Villa Maravilla, though stopped, still marked something more than the time of a death. A week after receiving Vincent's will, Poirot received a second unexpected visitor. This time, it wasn't a letter or a telegram. It was a physical figure silent with discreet steps and an uncertain gaze. Annette, the young servant of Villa Maravilla. "Monsieur Poirot," he said as he entered, twisting his hat in his hands, "I need to tell you something that I didn't know how to say before." Poirot invited her to sit down politely, without judgment. He poured a cup of tea for both of them. "Speak, mademoiselle, this time there's no judgment. Just listen." Annette swallowed and looked down. "That evening before dinner, I saw something I hid, not out of malice, but out of fear. I saw Camille in the library, not at the moment of death, but before, much before, as soon as possible. Around 5. He walked in with a firm stride, as if he expected to find something. When he came out, he was holding a letter that wasn't his. I recognized it. By the letterhead, it was from Vincent. Poirot bowed. "The letter you never sent. Yes, sir. The same one you found later, but in the chest in Vincent's room. And that night, when I saw it there, I knew someone had returned it." Poirot frowned, his fingers interlaced. So Camille read it before Vincent died. She knew exactly what he was thinking. She knew he had second thoughts, that he was contemplating abandoning the engagement. Annette nodded with a mixture of guilt and fear. When he walked into the library that night after dinner, he didn't come as a surprise. He knew what I was going to say to him, or what I was going to refuse to say. "And did you see anything else?" Annette hesitated a second longer. I heard, not words, but the tone. He was pleading with her for something. He seemed to be asking for time. She replied in a low voice, "It's too late." Then silence, and soon he was gone. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You did the right thing." After Annette left, Poirot remained alone in his living room for a long time. The pieces, all already in place, fit together with overwhelming precision. But now he realized that one last piece was still missing. Camille's final choice. That afternoon, Poirot asked for a copy of the Aix-en-Provence regional newspaper. On an almost unnoticed inside page, he read a brief note. Miss Camille Moreau has entered voluntary retirement at the Saint-Remy convent. She has publicly renounced her inheritance and requested that her name not be included in future family records. Poirot slowly closed the newspaper. So, mademoiselle, you have opted for the only punishment the law does not impose, self-exile. And sure, for the first time, she allowed compassion to dominate her thoughts about the case. Camille didn't seek external redemption, only silence. The same silence that had accompanied Vincent's death, the same silence that now became hers. Later that night, Poirot wrote in his diary, not as a detective, but as a man. Every crime is a shadow cast by an unfulfilled wish. But there is something more terrible than crime. It is the void left when all witnesses decide to remain silent, and when the only sound that remains, it is the echo of a clock that has stopped forever. He closed his notebook. He put away his pen, and finally, in the darkness of his room, Poirot whispered to no one in particular, "Justice has been served, not by law, not by punishment, but for the truth, and for the silence that at last had said everything." Chapter 15. The Hour That Never Came. Months passed since Poirot finally closed the Delattre case. Autumn was already blanketing Paris with its coppery leaves, and in his meticulously tidy apartment everything seemed to be returning to its usual course. But as with profound truths, some stories don't end with a revelation. Some linger. They change shape. They stay. One grey morning, while sorting through letters at his desk, Poirot received a gilt-edged envelope with no return address, but with an unmistakable stamp, the emblem of the National Library of France inside. A brief note. Monsieur Poirot, a private notebook belonging to the late Claire Beaumont has been deposited with this institution. Your name appears in the dedication. Poirot, without saying a word, stood up. In the library's rare manuscripts room, an archivist handed him the object, a modest notebook covered in worn leather. Inside, on the first page, was the dedication. To Hercule Poirot, if you ever wish to understand beyond crime. He flipped through it with the delicacy of a priest examining sacred scriptures. It wasn't a diary. It was a series of fragments, memories, undated passages. But in its lines, Claire's voice became clear, intimate, almost painful. Vincent wasn't a monster. He was a scared boy trapped in a man's body with too many expectations. I promised him love. He promised protection. But in his world, the past was a threat, not a part of him. I didn't come back to ruin him. I came back to look him in the eye and tell him I didn't hate him, that I didn't expect anything anymore. When he looked at me, not knowing what to say, I knew I was doomed. Because it's not about not loving, it's about not knowing how to hold it. Poirot closed the notebook, not out of lack of interest, but out of respect. Words weren't a key to solving anything. They were an emotional tomb, a closure that was never offered during life. That night in his apartment, Poirot meditated by his window overlooking the boulevard. The grandfather clock read 7:45, a symbolic hour he himself had set as a small ritualistic gesture, a way of trapping in time that which refuses to pass. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone, but since his return from Villa Maravilla, he had stopped his watch every night at that exact time, not out of superstition, but out of symbolism. But tonight he made a different decision. He walked over to the clock, opened the case with his little brass key, and started the pendulum again. The sound of ticking filled the room with a comforting regularity, as if time and everything that goes with it could begin again. Poirot, standing by the clock, whispered to himself, "The time has come, not in Villa Maravilla, not with Vincent, but here, now, the time when the truth no longer weighs heavily, but is transformed." He sat down at his desk, and for the first time since the case, he picked up a new sheet of paper. On it he wrote, "Not all crimes need punishment. Some need to be remembered, because only memory compels us to change." And he signed his full name in small but firm letters, Hercule Poirot. Then he turned off the lamp. The clock continued to ring, and this time he didn't stop. Chapter 16. The Letter That Arrived Too Late. A week after resetting the clock, Poirot believed he had finally come full circle. The Delattre case, with all its shadows, silences, and absences, had left a mark on him, but it had also reminded him of his deepest conviction, that the truth, even if it takes time, always emerges. However, fate, like an invisible writer, seemed to have one more epilogue in mind. One cloudy morning, Georges announced with discreet surprise, "Sir, a letter has arrived by diplomatic courier, signed by the Belgian embassy." Poirot raised his eyebrow. "My own country's embassy? Curious. What Belgian affair could have entangled the Villa Maravilla clock?" The envelope was sealed with red wax. Inside was a typewritten letter, and a smaller, unopened envelope dated 1 month before the crime. The official letter explained that the enclosed envelope had been mistakenly intercepted at a consular office in Lyon, and held for security reasons during a correspondence review. Only now, after a review of pending files, had it been released and sent to its original destination. Vincent Delattre. Poirot, with growing interest, carefully opened the smaller envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in pale blue ink. "Vincent, I don't know if you'll dare read this. Perhaps it's already too late. But what I have to say cannot die within me. The son I lost 2 years ago was yours. I never told you because you never asked, and I didn't know how to bear that truth alone. I'm not making any further claims. I just want you to know that he existed, that he had a name, that however brief his life was, you were in it, even if you didn't know it. Claire." Poirot froze. That unexpected detail reconfigured the entire picture. Vincent wasn't just facing his romantic past. He wasn't just dealing with broken promises, a reputation, and impossible futures. He was also unknowingly carrying the absence of a denied paternity, and if, as Poirot had deduced, Claire appeared that day not to complain, but to free herself, then she didn't have this letter with her. She sent it, and it never arrived. "My God," Poirot murmured, his voice barely audible. Vincent died believing that Claire had returned on a whim. He didn't know that his story had already happened, that he became a father, that he lost, that he never had the chance to choose. He leaned back in his chair, leaving the letter on the table as if it were burning. The silence of Villa Maravilla, the wounded faces, the stopped clock, everything took on a crueler dimension. No one in that house knew this truth, and probably no one else would know it, except him. That night, Poirot wrote in his personal diary, not as a detective, not as a Belgian, not as an observer of the crime, but as a man. Every truth has a price, but the truth that comes late is the most costly of all, because it no longer changes the course of crime. It only makes it sadder. Vincent died believing himself to be the victim of moral blackmail. He died without knowing that he had become a father. He died without knowing that, for once, someone wasn't judging him, but simply wanted him to remember. Poirot placed the letter in a new envelope, addressed to Claire Beaumont, who was now living under a different name in a small village on the Atlantic coast. He did not accompany it with any notes. He only returned what always belonged to him. The clock in his apartment continued to tick away, but that night, as the ticking filled the room with its steady rhythm, Poirot knew one thing for sure. The crime was not just Vincent's death. The crime was everything that never arrived on time. Chapter 17. The Truth in the Burnt Paper. The afternoon was melancholy in Paris. A fitful breeze filtered through the cracks in the windows, gently stirring the fringes of the curtains. Poirot, with a slightly furrowed brow, leafed through the latest copy of Time, paying no real attention to the political and society columns. His mind remained trapped between Claire's letter and what could never reach Vincent de Latre's eyes. He was troubled by an idea that refused to be resolved. Why didn't Claire bring that truth with her when she showed up at Villa Maravilla? Why, instead of a direct conversation, did he entrust his confession to an envelope doomed to be lost? The answer was not in what Claire wrote, but in what Vincent tried to destroy. Poirot stood up with sudden determination and walked to his filing cabinet where he had kept a small object, forgotten since the first days of the case, the partially burnt piece of paper he rescued from the fireplace from the library. Until then, I had paid little more than technical attention to it. One sentence. I can't forgive, but I can't keep quiet any longer either. I had attributed it to Vincent. What if it wasn't? He removed the charred piece, placed it on a glass slide under a magnifying glass, and examined the handwriting. Again. But not, murmured Poirot. This is not a man's handwriting. He compared it with the manuscript of Claire's letter, now that he had her complete note. Identical slant, same rounded shape in the A's, the broken stroke in the T's. The burnt sheet had been written by Claire, not for Vincent. And if Vincent tried to burn it, it meant he had read it. Then he knew, Poirot said quietly. He knew he had become a father. And yet he didn't mention it in his posthumous letter, not even to Camille, not even to Claire. Out of shame, out of remorse, or because he'd already made a decision he didn't want to change. The detective leaned on his desk, closing his eyes. He visualized the scene in the library again, Claire enters. She speaks. She reveals the truth. He remains silent. She leaves. Afterward, he burns the letter. Not as a rejection, but as a denial. He couldn't bear that weight. Not in the midst of the engagement, the impending scandal, the fake future that was looming over him. Then Camille comes in. She finds it broken. And there, in that crack, she doesn't reach out. She just steps away. She leaves it alone. And that loneliness was what killed him. Later that evening, Poirot wrote to Claire a second time. This time, in his own words, Mrs. Claire, I received your letter and read the words Vincent never replied to. I also discovered that he did read your original message. He tried to destroy it. He couldn't. Flames never completely consume the truth. You should know that, in his cowardly way, he did understand. He didn't say anything, but his actions betrayed him. He refused to acknowledge it, not out of a lack of feeling, but out of fear. You weren't ignored. You were feared, as one fears anything that might shatter a comfortable fiction. I'm sending you the excerpt I rescued. It's yours. Just like that unrequited silence. With respect, Hercule Poirot. He attached the charred piece of paper, already fragile, almost useless as evidence, but not as a symbol. 2 weeks later, a small box arrived at Poirot's apartment door. There was no return address. Inside, only an envelope and a silver brooch in the shape of a broken pocket watch. The note said, Mr. Poirot, the boy was named Gabriel. He only lived 14 days. I named him after him, not his father's. But I take comfort in knowing that, in some corner of his mind, Vincent knew it. Thank you for making me feel like I didn't speak into the void. C.B. Poirot held the brooch for a long time between his fingers. Gabrielle, a short name, of wings, the silver watch had its hands stopped. Another hour stopped, he whispered, but this one makes sense. He placed the brooch on his desk, next to Vincent's letter and the burned fragment, not as evidence, but as a memory. The case was no longer a crime. It was a life not lived, a love without time, and a clock that stopped, not because of death, but because of mourning. Chapter 18. The Hug That Stopped the Clock. The afternoon was clear over Paris, as if the sky, after weeks of inner shadows, had decided to offer a respite of light. Poirot, sitting at his desk, silently contemplated the silver watch-shaped brooch, Claire's letter, and the burnt piece of paper. 3 pieces of a puzzle that no longer sought blame, but understanding. Throughout the case, Poirot had acted as an observer, organizing, deducing, interviewing, comparing alibis and silences. But now, faced with the whole picture, he understood that this story wouldn't be solved by capturing a murderer or by gathering suspects. This crime had occurred on another level, that of the human soul, where the truth comes not with handcuffs, but with recognition. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the passers-by. Life went on, oblivious to everything that had happened at Villa Maravilla. To Vincent, to Camille, to Claire, to Gabriel. Gabrielle, that was the name that rearranged all the pieces. Vincent had lived among fictions. The exemplary son, the perfect fiancé, the strategic air. His life was constructed like an elegant set, full of correct gestures and appropriate words. But the moment he learned, or sensed, that he had fathered a son, that he had lost him, and that this truth came from a woman he hadn't known how to love, was also the moment the set collapsed. Poirot now saw clearly the exact sequence of the tragedy. Claire, after sending the letter, which never arrived, decides to show up at Villa Maravilla, not to complain, but to look Vincent in the eye, to tell him that his son existed, that she wasn't seeking revenge. Just to let him know. Vincent welcomes her. He doesn't expel her, but he doesn't embrace her either. He listens to her. He doesn't react. Then, when she leaves, he takes the letter he himself had worthlessly stashed away and burns it. Not out of hatred, but out of fear. Because he doesn't want to bear the burden of what is irreversible. Then Camille comes in. She finds him empty. He wants to explain. He doesn't know how. She doesn't ask any more questions. She just says goodbye, wordlessly. And that night, Vincent doesn't take his medication. Maybe out of distraction. Maybe by choice. The clock stops at 7:45, as if time itself had accepted its surrender. Poirot made one last note in his notebook. Not a summary of the case, but a final epigraph. A crime that wasn't a crime. A murder without a killer. A truth that came, like all important truths, too late to prevent the wound, but just in time to heal it. That night, he gathered everything related to the case. The letters, the brooch, the fragment. He placed them in a wooden box, closed it, and wrote a word on the outside, comprehension. She wouldn't be sent to the police. It would not be filed in its resolved cases. It would be kept as a private lesson. On justice that is not imposed but achieved. About love that is not shouted but remembered. About the crime that is not committed but allowed. The next day, Poirot received one last letter. It was from Camille. Mr. Poirot, I've read your correspondence with Claire. I knew it before I opened it. I felt it in the brooch you left on the convent door. Yes, Vincent died for many reasons. But above all, he died because no one dared to stop him when he could still be saved. I didn't do it. And that's my burden. But it's also my beginning. Thank you for not forgetting. Thank you for not reducing it to just another case. Camille Poirot read the letter calmly. Then he walked over to his grandfather clock, which read 7:45 as usual. He looked at it for a moment, and this time, he didn't stop it. He let it go. Life, he thought, cannot be controlled like a perfect mechanism. It has flaws, cracks, irregular heartbeats. And yet it moves forward. Goodbye, Vincent Delattre, Poirot murmured, crossing his arms behind his back. Let your silence speak for itself to anyone who dares to listen. The clock struck 8, and Poirot, with his usual composure, bowed to time.